It's almost Thanksgiving. Today we're going to be talking about 6 mistakes you should avoid when making a pumpkin pie from scratch. At the end of this video, you'll have a pumpkin pie that has a flaky crust, a bottom that's not soggy, and a filling that is smooth, creamy, and super custardy. It's a once-in-a-year type of occasion, so you definitely don't want to mess this up. We're not wasting any time here, let's make a pumpkin pie. We're gonna start by making an all-butter pie crust. In this large bowl, I have 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. To that, I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of salt and 1 tablespoon of sugar. Mix that up real quick. Next, add 10 tablespoons, that's 1 stick, plus 2 tablespoons of cubed up unsalted butter to the flour mixture. And here comes mistake number 1 that you should avoid. You're using butter that's not cold. If you want the pie dough to be flaky, you really want to make sure that butter is nice and cold, and don't take it out of the fridge until you're ready to use it. These are cut into little tiny 1/2 inch cubes. Toss the butter around, making sure each cube is well coated in flour, and squish them with your fingers like this. Do that with all the butter pieces until the mixture is crumbly. Okay, we're gonna take a little cocktail break. Okay, no, this is actually not a cocktail. It is the liquid we're going to use to bring the pie dough together. Instead of using just water, we're going to use a mixture of vodka, apple cider vinegar, and a little bit of water. Vodka has the ability to hold the dough together while limiting the development of gluten, and since it is an alcohol, most of it will evaporate during baking, leaving the crust flaky and buttery. And apple cider vinegar will help tenderize gluten. Inside this glass, I have 2 tablespoons each of vodka and water plus 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. I'm adding some ice to keep it cold. Pour that liquid on the flour and butter mixture a little bit at a time. Toss everything together with a spatula. I'm avoiding using my hands too much because they're warm and I don't want my butter to melt. Add more liquid and repeat the tossing motion. You'll need to do this a few times. The dough is ready when you press it and it's holding together, but if it's a little crumbly, it's totally fine. What you don't want is a sticky dough, which is mistake number 2. A sticky dough is an indication that you added too much liquid and it is overworked and that the butter is melted. Definitely avoid that. Lay down a piece of parchment paper and transfer the dough onto it. I know it looks nothing like a dough right now because it's just a bunch of crumbs, but we're going to bring it together by pressing it and laminating it. Use the heel of your hand to press the dough down and fold the dough onto itself like this. Laminating the dough will help make it super flaky. It is the same thing as making croissants and biscuits. After a few rounds of folds, you should be able to see that the dough is no longer crumbly and it looks more like the pie dough that we know of. Again, don't overwork this. We're gonna wrap it up and let it chill in the fridge for at least 30 minutes so the gluten gets a chance to relax. Remove the dough from the fridge and let it come back to room temperature a bit before we roll it out. The dough will crack super easily if it's cold and hard. Flour the dough and transfer it onto a work surface. Don't forget to flour the rolling pin as well. Start rolling the dough out and rotate it frequently as you go. This is a good way to ensure the dough doesn't stick to the surface and that it's getting rolled out evenly. You want to roll the dough out to about 1/4 inch thick, and it should be bigger than the pie plate with a 2-inch overhang. By the way, this is a 9-inch pie plate. A lot of people like to use the rolling pin trick, but this is how I like to transfer the dough. I fold the dough in quarters and transfer it onto the plate. Position the pointy tip in the center of the plate, and when you unfold it, it's sitting on top of the plate nice and beautifully. Gently press the dough into the plate, but try not to stretch it. I like to press it into the crevices with my knuckles like this. Trim off the excess dough with some scissors, and you want to leave about 1 inch of border. Take the overhanging dough and tuck it underneath itself to create a thick border. And to give it that classic pumpkin pie look, we're gonna crimp the edges with your fingers. Take 2 fingers and press the edges in like this with your other finger to create a fluted edge. And look at that. Doesn't that look so much better than the frozen store-bought stuff? Now this step is super important, so don't skip it. Chill the pie crust in the freezer for at least 30 minutes. This will allow the gluten to relax and reduce the chance of the crust shrinking down during baking. After the crust has been chilled, it's nice and firm, and coming up next is mistake number 3 that a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, make, and that is not blind baking your pie crust. If you want your pumpkin pie to come out perfectly with a flaky crust and a bottom that's not soggy, you really want to make sure that crust is bake through before filling it with all that pumpkin goodness. It's a simple extra step, but it really brings your pie to the next level. So how do you blind bake a pie crust, you might ask? Well, it's super easy. Take a piece of foil or parchment paper, crumble it up, open it, and place it in the chilled pie crust. Then take some beans or rice or store-bought pie weights and dump them on top of the foil. The purpose of the pie weight is to prevent the crust from puffing up during baking. Pop that in a preheated 375 degrees Fahrenheit oven for about 20 to 25 minutes or until the edges are slightly browned. Notice I emphasize on slightly. It's okay if it looks a little pale because we're going to remove the pie weights and throw it back in the oven. But before we do that, we're going to brush the crust with some egg whites. This will create a barrier between the crust and the pumpkin filling. It's just another useful trick to prevent the bottom from becoming soggy. Pop the crust back in the oven and bake it for another 15 minutes and remove it from the oven and set it aside so we can move on to making what we've all been waiting for, the pumpkin pie filling. Before we start making the filling, I just want to address this. If you're stressing about using homemade pumpkin puree over the canned stuff, you're wrong. Use the canned stuff. There's no shame to this. I personally like using Libby's. It's got a great consistency and bright orange color, and most importantly, Libby is made with a specific variety of squash that's called the Dickinson squash. It's got lower moisture content and the flavor is just perfect for pumpkin pie. I've tried other organic brands, but they're just not as good. And yeah, I know technically it's not made with real pumpkin, but this is the way to go, so stop stressing and just use the can. Alright, I'm glad we had to talk and we got that out of the way. In a large mixing bowl, dump in one 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree. To that, add 2 whole eggs plus 2 egg yolks and 1/3 of a cup each of regular sugar and brown sugar. For the flavorings, add 1.5 teaspoons of good vanilla paste or extract and 2.5 teaspoons of homemade or store-bought pumpkin pie spice. I'm using homemade because I like the idea of customizing it with the spices that I like. Let me show you how to make it. Combine 1/4 each of ground clove and cardamom, 1 teaspoon each of cinnamon and ground ginger, 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric for color, and optionally, I know it sounds kind of weird, but trust me, a few cranks of black pepper. Once again, this is super customizable, so feel free to play with the spice based on your likings. Add all that to the pumpkin mixture along with 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Whisk everything together until it's smooth. In a small sauce pot on medium heat, pour in 1 1/4 cups of heavy cream plus 1/4 cup of maple syrup. The real stuff, not the maple flavor corn syrup. Bring that to a light simmer. As soon as you see bubbles around the edges, remove it from the heat. Place a damp towel under the bowl and we're now going to temper the pumpkin egg mixture with the hot cream. This will give the pumpkin pie filling a super smooth and creamy texture, almost like creme brulee. Pour the hot cream in the pumpkin mixture while whisking in 3 additions, and that's how you make the most luscious pumpkin pie filling. Pour the pumpkin pie filling into the pie crust, and pro tip, make sure you place the whole thing on a sheet tray. It'll make transferring it into the oven so much easier. And coming up next is our mistake number 5 you should definitely avoid if you want a super smooth pumpkin pie, and that is to bake it at a super high temperature. A super high temperature will make the pumpkin pie filling rise too much and crack, and it could also make it curdle. Instead, bake it low and slow at 325 degrees Fahrenheit for about 50 minutes to an hour. The pie is done baking when the edges around the crust are set, but the center still has a light wobble. Remove the pie from the oven and let it cool completely before slicing and topping with whipped cream. And speaking of whipped cream, look, you've come this far, you made your own pie crust, you made the most delicious pumpkin pie filling, so mistake number 6 is to top your pumpkin pie with store-bought canned whipped cream or Cool Whip. You really should make your own. It'll taste so much better. In a stand mixer bowl, add 2 ounces of softened cream cheese and 1/4 cup of sugar. The cream cheese will help stabilize the whipped cream. Beat it until it's nice and smooth, then slowly pour in 1 cup of very cold heavy cream. Stop halfway and scrape down the sides. Continue mixing and pour in the rest of the cream. Now let's talk about flavoring the whipped cream. There are many things you could add to whipped cream to make it more interesting, but for pumpkin pie, I'm gonna keep it real simple by adding some vanilla paste and bourbon. This is simple enough, yet it gives the cream so much more flavor and layers. Whip that up until it resembles a super smooth shaving cream. And when you lift up the whisk, a soft peak forms. That's the perfect consistency. Get all that into a container, and this of course can be made 3 days ahead before you're ready to serve your pumpkin pie. And when it's time, get a big slice and top it with a generous dollop of that homemade bourbon vanilla whipped cream. And that's how you make a super creamy pumpkin pie with a flaky crust. And don't forget, it's not hard to make a pumpkin pie as long as you avoid those mistakes. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you back in the kitchen next time.